could you give me a timetable from beginning to end of the hat process?
Okay, as far as the stakeholders go, that's something you have to decide. I would encourage you, and I don't know who all makes up that group, to have a realtor, to have a banker, to have, if there's a housing authority, those people that are interested in housing in your community. And that can look so different. Some communities can have a stakeholder group of 5, and some people may have 20 or 25. It kind of depends on the size of your community, what interests you have in your community, and if you already have a housing group, then that's probably a good start, but you would also want to reach out to other members of your community, not just, your stakeholders really kind of are the ones that put the hat together, do the final tool, complete it, but I would encourage you to reach out to all members of your community, have them reach out to all members of your community, and they just kind of be the general group. As far as time frame, it kind of depends on the community. Because you can probably put this together in a month or 2 if you want to have a lot of meetings and you really want to hustle. I've had communities do it in 6 months, and a year might be dragging it out a little bit because things can change. And I would say a lot of people have asked me how long the hat's good for. And my comment to them, it kind of depends on the change of your community. If you did a hat right before the tornado and then the tornado struck, you probably want to do another one because it's not really relevant anymore. So it kind of depends on your community and how the changes of your community.
Also, I want to add a little bit to those that have the naysayers in the groups that have your problems with. Invite them to your meetings, try to get them to buy into what you're trying to do. Because a lot of times what it is you haven't invited them because you know they're the problem child. And you don't want to deal with that problem child in front of, and a lot of times all they want to do is be involved, and they may still not like it when it's all done, but you can come back and say, you were a part of the process. They may not agree with what you ended up doing, but it was still part of the process. So we have found that out. We used to do community development academies, and we had issues with that. And you really find out that a lot of times it's not the individual that's the problem. It's the group. It's the old-fashioned high school clique type group. I'm honest, it happens in every community. I come from a very small community. You're the ones that's always done it. You're the ones that are still going to be the ones that always do it. But you haven't really opened it up to have other people help you come in and do it. And that's the whole process that you've got to come in on and this could have happened from your mother had a fight with their mother 50 years ago, and you don't deal with them because of that. And you've got to really get past that mentality. Like I said, I come from a small town. I know how it is. I can relate very well, but you have to look outside, as we say, outside of that box, and open it up to try to get them involved. And the best way you can do that is to offer those naysayers into the meetings, because then they can't come in and complain, well, you didn't tell me what was going on. Because now they know what's going on, and they may not attend everything, and they may rattle off the first time, but you've opened up the opportunity for them to come in. And a lot of times people don't invite that opportunity because you don't want to deal with it. I can guarantee it's easier to deal with it up front than it is once you've made your decision and it hits the paper.
So, a couple themes. Do your homework, and it's better to invite the folks in to have the conversation than to not have it. And so it's okay it's okay if there's a controversial project. It's okay if there's folks upset. It's not okay to ignore them and not give them a chance to have input, right?
Exactly.
To Patty's point, that sometimes what we tend to do is cater our projects to the programs that are available. I think a lot of communities in the past have spent a lot of time doing this kind of surveying that CDBG requires, the door-to-door surveying, and maybe working within the parameters that funding allows, that can be pretty limiting. And I feel like I've been in some meetings before where we've kind of said, you know what, those CDBG programs aren't working. So that might be the idea that there's some some new ideas being brought here today might be, I think, a lot of the interest that brought some of us here today. So I guess I have a two-part question. One, as we look at a different kind of analysis here that the hat provides, is there going to be any kind of taking less focus on that door-to-door survey to measure income requirements that we have to meet to, qualify for the CDBG program? And then secondly, I'm very interested in what Jason, thank you, is finding valuable for the data that drives the kind of investment that you might bring to this.
What you've just described is, for the majority of the programs that are delivered by community development, through community development block grant funds, which are actually funded by HUD, and for rural development, they are geared toward the low and very low income. You're talking about the assessment of what's the low and moderate income picture in your community, what's the median household income. That's the reason they do the door-to-door surveys. And sometimes that's the reason those programs may fill a gap that does or does not exist. And that's why you've got to do the homework. The public resources are there. They're tools in the toolbox, but that's what I'm talking about. You got to step outside, do your homework, do your research, dig into the data that Jason's going to talk about, and combine tools, stack tools, work with your employers. I'm going to give you an example that where we worked with an employer to deliver a workforce housing project in, hopefully we're going to get it done, in Rexford, little bitty Rexford, Kansas. But it started with the employer, and it started with an inclusive conversation. The employer is a dairy, a large family dairy, a father and 4 sons. I don't know, Randy, how many cows total do they milk?
7,500 right now, but wants to get 15,000.
And what they really wanted to do was provide safe, affordable housing in a community, not on the farm, not on the dairy, in a community, immerse their employees in that rural community, and develop a higher quality of life so they retained those employees. It could be a manufacturing firm, it could be a dairy, it could be a lot of different employers. But the desire was to get safe, affordable housing. Our program happened to fit. And we worked with KHRC with the new moderate income program that the state has. And we brought the tools together. And sometimes it's not the public resources that work. Sometimes it's totally private sector resources and investors in your community who happen to have an employment base that they want to retain and they want to continue to grow. But what we're saying is you haven't done your homework. For decades, we haven't approached it. We've been going after solutions without identifying what the real challenges and the problems are. The assessments that CDBG asks for, that we ask for, those are all tools to make sure we're investing to meet the target audience that our programs are designed for. But they may not be solely what you need in your community, but you're not going to know unless you do your homework, unless you do the data and analyze it. And that's what HIAC is all about, is testing that data, talking about it.
This is great. So we're going to do one more question, okay, and then we'll move on to the next presenter.
Hi, I'm Millard Fox from Ashland, Kansas, and we've done a lot of what I think you're talking about, but I don't really know how to present it. I guess what I'd like to see is I'd like to look at somebody else's homework, see what they've submitted to you and how you, because it'll be different in every community, but if there was something that we could get from you that would give us a guideline specific, I mean along this PowerPoint line, but something that you've accepted so we know how to present it and put it together so we can come to you with all our guns blaring.
When I think that's what HIAC is about. is for you to do the best job that you can with your stakeholders, and we try to make the hat as simple as possible, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. There is no perfect hat. There's no, well, maybe you need more stakeholders, or maybe you didn't analyze it. We analyze it a little different than you do, but there is no perfect hat. It's all about what's specific to your community, and I think, so if you would complete the hat and then come into the HIAC, I think at that time, then we can talk about things that we see in your, because we do spend, you present for a half hour, and we you're there for 2 hours. So we have an hour and a half reserved that we can give feedback about the hat, about what we see for your community. And it's not us dictating, it's not like me standing here giving a presentation. We have 8 people, 2 from each or 6 people, 2 from each agency, and whoever you bring. So we really sit around the table and just talk about what your hat is, and it's just a real interactive thing. Then we can talk specifically about your community. And that's really the best thing. And if you're struggling doing that, I would recommend bringing in a regional program manager from our agency, and I'd be happy to contact one of them for you, or let you know which ones those are, and have them come in and look at that. But I'm happy to look at something like that. The reality of it is you get a better input when you get 6 state heads around the table looking at your hat instead of just me. But I want to take a moment, just a second, to go back to the survey too. With CDBG housing, there is no survey required.
If
So-
you don't have the census data that supports though.
No,
You don't.
with housing, each house you end up doing is low to moderate income. So you do not have to do an LMI survey for housing application. But you do for water, sewer, community facilities.
So this has been a great conversation. Thank you, Linda. Thank you to Linda and Debbie. We will have a panel here in a little while so we can continue on the conversation. So it's a pleasure speaking of public-private partnerships. Exciting to have Liz Sosa come on up and talk to us about public square communities.
Good morning. Actually, this was a great segue into the various perspectives I'm going to give you from the Public Square Communities work in 2 pilot communities. So these were actually great questions, and it was great to follow that particular presentation so that we can continue the dialogue about mitigating housing through citizen engagement. So again, my name is Liz Sosa, and I actually live in Garden City, Kansas, but I work with a community group by name of Public Square Communities. Jeanette Siemens is also in the back of the room today. She's raising her hand. She's partnering with me in this particular housing pilot. So again, any and all questions can be directed to both of us at some point. I'm actually just going to be brief because I really have a different perspective on the way that we have gone about this particular housing topic. Public Square Communities really prides itself on being the convener of community conversations. If you had to ask me to sum up what it is that we do, we host, we facilitate, we convene community conversations in rural communities. To that end, housing has really become a very prevalent topic as we go about having these conversations. We ourselves actually work around a very strategic process, and that process starts with what we consider to be the public square. When Terry Woodbury founded this particular organization, it was with the intent that all community decisions, that true civic engagement and community sustainable change starts with bringing together members of the 4 sectors of your community. And so every bit of work that we do with our existing communities, with the special projects we engage in, really centers around making sure that all 4 sectors are represented at that particular table for whatever dialogue it is that we're having. So again, just briefly, education is your typical K through 12 education, post-secondary, anyone with really the educational element in mind. The human services represented by the House is actually the broadest of all of our sectors. It is anybody that protects the family unit or the individual. So this ranges from healthcare, civil organizations, social service, social welfare, not-for-profit organizations, churches, you name it. Business, the green storefront, really is anyone who protects the tax base. So any of your taxing entities, the people who contribute to your tax base. Industry, manufacturing, agriculture, retail, service. And then finally, you're looking at your government sector, not just your elected officials as we tend to invite to the table. We're really looking at this from the perspective of anyone in public service. So this could range from your police and your firefighters to your cemetery sexton to anybody in between. We're really looking at making sure that no matter what dialogue occurs, we do have representation from all four sectors present at those particular conversations. The reason we got to housing was because our process of community development really has brought us to this point. When we work with a community, we actually go in and through a series of interviews, dialogues, and finally a large-scale community conversation, we are allowing the community, through a citizen-driven process, determine what the goals are. Then we facilitate that same citizen-driven process to help accomplish those particular goals. We ourselves are not the consultant that you bring in to do the work, hand it off to you, put it in a binder and stick it on a shelf. What we do instead is continually engage the community in conversations based on positive dialogue and assets within a community to reach goals, again, that the community has set. Over the course of about the last 10 years of our work, housing has risen to the top of the goals that communities wish to set for themselves. Something is missing in those particular communities that lends them to believe, much like you heard before, that there's either a perceived absence of adequate housing or that there is an actual gap in what exists and what should be. We use the word perception a lot because for most people, it's as real as the factual data. And so a lot of it is changing cultures as we go about that. In this particular case for the pilot community, Terry Woodbury had an opportunity to visit with the group that we refer to as our investors. It's a group of people who said, hey, we're really concerned about housing in our particular communities. What can we do to help mitigate that risk of us completely either dying or losing those abilities to impact the work that our communities are doing towards this end as well? We look at investors not always being financial investors, but investors in the long-term sustainability. So what they came up with was really that we've been kind of scaring off development in our communities for a long time. We are traditionally working in very rural communities, and as you know, roughly 60 to 70% of our state has communities ranging in population between 5,000 and less. You can see that most of our work really does take place in those particular communities. Really, we haven't seen a whole lot of new construction in rural communities over the last couple of decades. You know, number one, we've had an exodus of a lot of our people to more urban areas. Number two, the cost of providing housing in those particular communities has not risen at the same rate as the cost. So to build a home and what it's valued at are no longer the same. We build a house and what happens? Immediately, its value is less than what we just spent on the note to actually perform that particular construction project. So we're also looking at the fact of how do we realign some of those values, and then really how do we make sure that we are not limited by low income, moderate income, but instead are looking at what we would deem to be quality, affordable housing. Much different than just pegging it into a term of income levels or of demographic information. So what we looked at is we said, how could we investigate this further with our existing communities? Public Square Communities actually does work in roughly about 25 to 27 communities, which equals close to 60 towns. So our work is not just limited by a geographic boundary of a city limit. We actually work throughout the state with various regions, collaborative efforts, counties, etc. The first thing that we were really looking is how do we make sure that we are looking at housing from both an economic perspective and from a true housing stock perspective. How are we making sure that those two are aligned to some degree? In a lot of the communities in which we work, the big bad Z word is preventing us from doing a lot of meaningful future work. I mean zoning. Some sort of standard, some sort of expectation in an environment where most businesses and people already feel like they are either overtaxed or overregulated. So how do we approach this from a different perspective to where standards become an expectation, a quality norm that we share, versus more of an imposition, something that's imposed upon us without our real need? How do we close that financing gap? I'm from Western Kansas, so building something in Western Kansas, when you're looking at one or two properties at a time, or when you're looking at having to drive multiple miles between various communities, really impedes progress when you're looking at mass production, the scalability, if you will, of creating housing stock. How do we go back and align those property values with construction costs? That was a big one. These are all the different goals we were looking at. And finally, how do we invest capital both from a financial, human, and social element? Again, we're in the business of convening quality, positive community conversations. So housing sometimes does not feel like it would align in a community conversation, but it does. How do we bring your community to the table? How do we represent those 4 sectors so that the dialogue that occurs, much like we just heard, happens at the front end rather than the end when we're trying to sell them a project? But also, how do we engage the community from start to finish? How do we make sure that as a community, we have representatives that are not only serving from the investigative standpoint, the research, the dialogue back and forth with our communities, and as we proceed, how are we constantly filling in our community on what's happening, what's occurring? So we were looking at it from all of these different elements, and we narrowed down 2 of our actual communities that we decided to pilot this particular process in. The reason these 2 communities were chosen, Humboldt and Greeley County, Tribune, as most of you would know it, was that they had not only been in the Public Square community process the longest, but they both had active housing action teams, meaning that they, through their goal-setting process, had actually brought together a group of citizens from the 4 sectors who were working on this particular issue. Really, we looked at them from the perspective of comparable. One was on the east side of the state, one was on the west. Population-wise, demographic-wise, they were somewhat relevant. So we would be comparing apples to oranges, we realized, but that we would actually have some sort of baseline information from which to look. The process took us about 13 months for this initial pilot. And when we look at a pilot, much like we facilitate a community conversation, we do not go in with any intended outcome. We merely facilitate the agenda that is citizen-driven. So we even went into this pilot not with an outcome other than the goals we were trying to accomplish. If these are the primary topics, how do we look at those and how do we start gaining some sort of results that we could move forward and apply to other communities? We introduced the pilot to the community through a community conversation. And our communities are aware of that process. Really what it entails is making sure that we fill a room much like this with the 4 sectors, with demographic representation, age, socioeconomic background, new to the community, has lived there their whole lives to the community, all of those different aspects so that when we finish, we have a room that looks much like this. If someone were to walk in to that particular conversation, they would not be looking around saying, oh, it's the same group that's always there. It's the same group of decision makers that's always there. We really do aim to make sure that we have adequate representation. From there, we actually received the go-ahead from the community saying, we're looking at housing and we want to do this in a rather investigative way. We really want to dig much deeper than the surface. So, if you will, taking some sort of housing assessment and taking it even deeper. How do we really take each of those components and turn it into a relevant action item for this particular community? I'll use the example of Greeley County. They actually, from their original housing action team, had 2 different housing organizations established. One was a not-for-profit, one was a for-profit. In that particular case, we had representatives from both of those action teams on this particular pilot group. We had that banker, we had the realtor, we had the school, we had the hospital, who's one of their primary employers in the community. We had business owners. We had citizens. We had as much representation on this group as possible. In Humboldt, they actually combined their housing action team and their business action team to serve as their pilot team. So both approached it a little bit differently. They each did a strategic assessment, taking what could be considered to be a housing assessment tool such as Humboldt used, because they had applied for various grant applications. In others, it was more of the investigative. How do we go through and we rank our community? How do we do Mapping, how do we color code so that we can actually look on this map and know who has a dilapidated property? How does this information be made public to the point where if you're that person on that map with the dilapidated property, everybody knows it? How do we start the dialogue about what this could look like? The other intent of really investigating this from a further perspective was the idea that we are not trying to only go after the existing resources. How do we re-engage some of our local investors, the folks that may have brought property outside the state? Or someone who really has only been nickeled and dimed for minor sponsorships who might actually be willing to invest large sums of money for their community. So we were really engaging in a much different way. From that, we were really making sure that the outcomes, what information was received back, was publicly shared along the way, so that no one could understand or no one could actually challenge this team saying that they themselves have the predetermined outcome. They actually presented to a group of statewide investors, so people who came together who helped formulate our case statement to begin with, and presented to them with their ideas. An example being, in Greeley County, they went in, much of them, if I'd asked their initial perception, saying, well, we need new housing. We need new housing. People come to town and they need a house. We don't have anything. And what they ended up with was the need for rental housing. That many people do come to the community, but they want to test it out first. They would like to do some sort of rental instead. Change the entire way that they went about cultivating investment and interest in building housing stock in their community. Humboldt, for example, also felt that they needed new housing, was struggling a little bit with how the house that was built through their construction trades program at their school somewhat devalued the other new construction properties because it bid out so low every year in comparison to maybe construction costs. They made back what they put into it, but not more. But they did have a realtor list that had 40 properties that never seemed to move off of the realtor list. So they actually decided to tackle those first as being their initial project instead. How can they really look at rehabbing and making them relevant, meaning instead of a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, maybe it's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. Maybe it's an expanded floor plan. Maybe it's updating and upgrading. Maybe it's taking care of all of the other code elements that may go into it. So really taking all of the data that they had received throughout all of these assessments, all of these various conversations, and apply them to an ongoing project. The key being that much like we talked about with the other housing assessment tool, is that they were not actually seeking funding to fill a gap. They were identifying the gap and then seeking relevant funding. Humboldt was actually awarded one of the KHRC grants this year based on their proposal, based on this particular work. Greeley County continues to work with 2 developers on potentially bringing the type of housing that they need to their community. The ongoing really revelation of that is, again, how do you do an economy of scale? How do you continue to partner with neighboring communities so that housing in one could often benefit housing in the other? Or if you're bringing a developer to town who isn't from there, how do you make it worth their while to build in one and another? How do you start looking at zoning and property valuations in a way that really engages conversation throughout the whole community, so that in the event that you do add some form of zoning requirement or some sort of regulation, it's a community-based decision as opposed to one that's handed down. All of those different things were what we experienced in this particular pilot. I just wanted to be brief because it's really tagging on to much what was said about the housing assessment tool. And then as you hear from Jason in terms of true development, you'll see how it kind of connects the dots. Really, in closing, for us, it's more about how do we continue to have those particular conversations with your community as opposed to just specific decision makers, so that it's long-term sustainable and that there's complete buy-in from communities at large. So I'll be interested to hear any questions as we move into the transition to Jason's presentation.
Thank you, Liz. As someone who's worked in different sectors and worked around the state, to have the folks from Commerce here talking about the programs, to have Public Square talking about their great work across the state. Many of you, if not all of you, have firsthand experience, so this is really exciting and very fun. It's good. And feels like we probably need a short break, don't we? All right, 5 minutes. Let's take a 5-minute break. There are restrooms on the first floor and the second floor, all right? We call that a one function break, so you pick your function, all right? But be back here in about 5 minutes and we'll get started with Jason's presentation, okay? Thank you.